Man is under all conditions immersed in a sea of God's blessings. Therefore, be thou not hopeless under any circumstances, but rather be firm in thy hope. Abdul Baha. We ask God to endow human souls with justice so that they may be fair and may strive to provide for the comfort of all, that each member of humanity may pass his life in the utmost comfort and welfare. Then this material world will become the very paradise of the kingdom. This elemental earth will be in a heavenly state, and all the servants of God will live in the utmost joy, happiness, and gladness. We must all strive and concentrate all our thoughts in order that such happiness may occur to the world of humanity. Abdul Baha.
So today our speaker is Mrs. Mona Khademi, and she'll be talking about the life of Laura Clifford Barney, the compiler of some answered questions. Mona Khademi was born in Tehran, Iran. She received her BA degree from Pahlavi University, today's Shiraz University, MA degree from American University in Washington, D.C., and has worked towards a PhD degree at Imperial College, London. As an independent researcher, Mona Khademi has presented research papers and talks at Baha'i and non-Baha'i international conferences in Europe and the United States. Several of her papers and the proceedings of the conferences have been published in English and in Persian as articles and chapters of books. Since the year 2000, Mona Khademi has been researching about the life of Laura Clifford Dreyfus Barney and has presented papers about her findings at Baha'i, Iranian, and Middle Eastern Studies conferences, as well as the Embassy of Latvia in Washington, D.C., and the Library of Congress. She has published several papers based on years of research, and the biography that she has written, titled The Life of Laura Barney, was published recently by Ronald Publisher. Mona Khademi works as an arts management consultant in Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much for this introduction. It is with much pleasure that I am presenting this talk today. I would like to dedicate today's talk to the brave women of Iran who are demanding their basic rights. Allow me to thank Armin and Peymane Parhami and everyone else who has helped with today's program. And thanks to each one of you for joining. And I see many of my friends in the audience. To give you a brief introduction of the Baha'i Faith, I'm going to read excerpts from the Appendix A of the recently published biography, The Life of Laura Barney. And here is the book. In the middle of the 19th century in Iran, a young merchant announced that he was the bearer of a message destined to transform the life of humanity. He took the name the Bab, meaning the gate in Arabic. With his call for spiritual and moral reformation, the Bab's prescription for spiritual renewal was revolutionary. The mission of the Bab, which lasted only 6 years, was to prepare the way for the coming of a manifestation of God who would usher in the age of peace and justice promised in all the world's religions. Baha'u'llah, meaning the glory of God. Baha'u'llah was the promised one, foretold by the Bab. In his writings, he outlined a framework for the development of a global civilization, which considers both the spiritual and material dimensions of human life. For this, he endured 40 years of imprisonment, torture, and exile. In order to guarantee that his revelation would achieve its purpose of creating a united world and to safeguard the unity of the Baha'i community, Baha'u'llah appointed his eldest son, Abdul Baha, as the center of his covenant. Following his father's passing, Abdul Baha devoted his ministry to furthering his father's faith and to promoting the ideas of peace and unity. In turn, Abdul-Baha established principles for the operation of the Universal House of Justice and stated that after his passing, the Baha'is must turn to his eldest grandson, Shoghi Effendi, whom he named guardian of the Baha'i faith. For 36 years, with extraordinary foresight, wisdom, and devotion, Shoghi Effendi systematically nurtured the development, deepened the understanding, and strengthened the unity of the Baha'i community. The Universal House of Justice, the International Governing Council of the Baha'i Faith, was established in 1963. It is a 9-member body elected every 5 years by the entire membership of all national Baha'i assemblies. Now to Laura Barney's story. The Baha'is know of Laura Clifford Barney for her greatest legacy, the book called Some Answered Questions, of questions that were posed by her to Abdul-Baha and his answers, which was compiled and published in 1908. But what else do we know about her? Of course, Some Answered Questions was her greatest achievement. I believe it is important to learn as to how this book came into existence, important to learn about the life of this amazing woman who learned about the modern and progressive teachings of the Baha'i faith and dedicated her life by adapting its teachings and principles to her social and community activities. I have to mention that I have a lot of quotes during this presentation, over 100, and in order to save time, I will not mention when a quote is read. Laura Barney was born in 1879 to a family of industrialists and artists in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her mother was Alice Pike Barney, an artist, philanthropist, and prominent civic and social leader. Laura's father, Albert Clifford Barney, was a wealthy Dayton, Ohio manufacturer and industrialist. Their first child was Natalie, who was born in 1879, and Laura was born 3 years later. The daughters had a rich and privileged childhood. They were accustomed to wealth and luxury from early years of their lives. They had French governesses and private tutors for the early years of their education. Their summer residence was a house with 26 rooms. In 1886, Laura's parents decided to send their daughters to a private boarding school in France. Laura was 13 years old when she returned to America and entered a Catholic convent school in Washington, D.C. Her father had moved the family to Washington in 1889. That year, Laura's mother went to Paris to study art, and Laura was studying dramatic arts and sculpture in that city. It was in 1900 that Laura heard of the faith of Baha'u'llah through May Ellis Bowles, later Maxwell, in Paris. May was among the first group of Westerners who had gone to visit the son of the Prophet founder, Abdul-Baha. Abdul-Baha was known to the Baha'is as the master, Agha. Soon after Laura made her first pilgrimage to Akka, Palestine in October of that year. And in a talk that she gave the following year, she described her first meeting and the message she had sent to Abdul Baha, which she wrote, this is the message she sent to Abdul Baha, that I believe that he must be the Christ spirit of the day, that the whole world was waiting for him, but that I could not feel it, but that if he was the Christ spirit of the day, he, of course, could prove it to me by making me yearn to follow the only path of true self-sacrifice and virtue. She says, I sent this message because I always believe that everything should be based on sincerity, and I do not want to go in an attitude which I do not absolutely feel was mine. So I went with my cousin the next morning. The master swept into the room and bidding us to be seated, he began to speak. Of course, I could not understand the talk which he spoke, very unfortunately. But the spirit was so strong that went forth that one could follow the words that came to us through the clear translation. My eyes that had until then been blinded gradually opened. First, we remained perfectly still. After a while, I felt the tears coming to my eyes and running down my cheeks. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of absolute gratitude. Tears that one might shed if one had been locked up in a dark prison for years. It seemed that I had often tried to get out of this darkness that surrounded me, but in vain. So as I heard the master's words and felt that he was the Christ spirit of the day, my tears continued to flow and my heart to beat with absolute love, absolute hope and happiness. Laura's belief in the teachings of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, and acceptance of his faith proved to be the spark that ignited a fire never to be quenched. As Hand of the Cause of God, Dr. Ugo Giaccheri later wrote. He continued, her ideals and aspirations found fulfillment in her activities in the service of the Baha'i faith. During her first trip, she was 21 years old. In those days, Abdul Baha was confined to the city of Akka and was permitted to receive only a few visitors. Imagining a refined young Western woman from a wealthy family visiting the city of Akka of those years is difficult. However, she had special attraction to living in those surroundings. It was after her departure from Akka on one of these early trips that Abdul Baha revealed a tablet for her, giving her the title of Amatul Baha, handmaiden of Baha. Abdul Baha wrote, I will henceforth address thee, the handmaid of Baha, so that it may indicate that thou hast attained to a new assignation. Laura went on her second pilgrimage in spring of 1901. It was during this trip that she met Abdul Fazael. the celebrated Baha'i scholar and teacher in Egypt, and she later accompanied him to Paris, where he stayed for over 3 months. And later that year, Laura accompanied Abul Fazail to United States. And after a short stay in Chicago, he came to Washington, D.C. Next image, please. It was Laura and her mother who made the lodging arrangements and paid for his expenses. He left the United States in December of 1904. Laura's associations with him and their meetings during these times may have helped her further understanding of the faith and perhaps learning Persian. By the way, Laura's mother, Alice, who was an artist, painted a portrait of Abul Fazail during his stay in Washington. The painting is at the Smithsonian Museum of American Arts in Washington, D.C. Laura's third trip was in 1904. This time she stayed until end of spring of 1906. And except for 2 or 3 trips outside of the Holy Land, she was there during the whole time. These visits to Akka became the center of Laura Barney's life and sources of stimulation and inspiration. I'll talk about the significance of this long stay afterwards. At the request of Abdul Baha, Laura Barney, accompanied by Hippolyte Dreyfus and Madame Lachenay of France, who was her chaperone, traveled to Iran, the native land of Baha'u'llah, in 1906. Laura had met Hippolyte Dreyfus in Paris in 1900. Like Laura, he was introduced to the Baha'i faith the same year by May Bowles, and he was a Frenchman 6 years her senior. Hippolyte had studied law and had a doctoral degree and was practicing before the Paris Court of Appeals. He became the first Frenchman to believe in Baha'u'llah. He later gave up his legal career to devote himself to Oriental studies and comparative religion, plus Arabic and Persian, intending to translate the Baha'i writings. Hippolyte's father, mother, his sister, and brother-in-law all joined the Baha'i faith. Laura and her companions first visited Ashgabat in Russian Turkmenistan, where the first Baha'i house of worship was being built. Then they traveled to Iran. Laura Barney was the first Western Baha'i woman to visit Iran. Her travel document shows that she was in Iran for 9 weeks. In Iran, they met with government officials, prominent people, and the Baha'is. They were welcomed and greeted lavishly and with dignity. While in Tehran, Laura sent a letter to her mother, reassuring her that she should not worry about her, stating that Iran is one of the most peaceful countries that she had seen. That's over 100 years ago in Iran. In another letter, she said that the Baha'is there were wonderfully sincere and kind, and the people she met were among the most important people of Persia. In Isfahan, they were hosted by local dignitaries. In Tabriz, a city in northwestern part of Iran, they were greeted and escorted by the Baha'is. There, the Foreign Office agent met with them and asked them many questions, including inquiries about the Baha'i faith. He made comments about Laura Barney's command of Persian and the fact that she had no accent like other foreigners. And he said that she speaks better than many educated Iranians. Prior to the Westerners' arrival in Tabriz, the Crown Prince, Muhammad Ali Mirza, was shown pictures of them. He invited them to an audience with him, which lasted an entire day. They remained in Tabriz for 9 days. Then they went to Baku, despite the troubled conditions brought on by the constitutional revolution, which was underway. Laura had insisted on visiting this city. The city of Baku is well known to Baha'i history for its prison fortress, where the Bab was imprisoned for 9 months, from July 1847 to April of 1848. He was executed by firing squad in 1850. Prior to her visit to Iran, as I mentioned earlier, Laura spent about a year and a half, from 1904 until early summer of 1906, in Akka. Details of these visits to and her long stay in Akka during this period are of great significance. This period is described by Shoghi Effendi as the most troublous and dramatic of Abdul Baha's ministry. Abdul Baha was still as a prisoner of the Turkish government. A summary of the accounts of Laura's long stay in those years will be given. These are based on the memoirs of Dr. Yunus Afrukhte, whom I will refer to as Yunus Khan. He was the secretary and translator of the master, who rendered Laura Barney's questions from English into Persian and converted the master's answers from Persian to English. Yunus Khan recalled that Abdul Baha would sit at the head of the dinner table and Laura Barney sat on his left, and Ethel Rosenberg, the first English Baha'i who had accompanied Laura, sat to her left. Often, several pilgrims and friends were also present. Yunus Khan himself was sitting to Abdul Baha's right. In 1904, when Laura began posing her questions, Abdul Baha was concerned about the approach of turmoil and upheaval. Therefore, no permission was granted to anyone to enter Akka. Miss Barney hardly ever left the house of Abdul Baha, except on certain occasions to visit the shrine of Baha'u'llah, which was undertaken with great care and caution. Like the other Western friends, Yunus Khan wrote, this lady received her share of spiritual education at the dinner table. He continued, the master's excessive workload only allowed time allotted for such question and answers sessions at the dinner table, and then only at lunchtime, at about 1 p.m. Yunus Khan recorded that Laura Barney was endowed with an avid enthusiasm for acquiring spiritual qualities and heavenly attributes. And that is why Abdul Baha honored her with the title of Amatul Baha. He wrote that she was a shy woman, the quintessence of purity and piety. In his words, Laura immersed herself in the ocean of divine knowledge where she discovered many a precious pearl. She considered the prison city of Akka and the small house of the beloved of the world preferable to the most splendid mansions of Western countries. In the introduction of Some Answered Questions, Laura Barney wrote that one day the master said, "I have given you my tired moments," as he rose from the table after answering her questions. Sometimes weeks would pass before she would get her instructions. She wrote, "But I could well be patient, for I had always before me the greater lesson, the lesson of his personal life." She continued, "In these lessons, he is the teacher adapting himself to his pupil and not the orator or poet." She was greatly favored by Abdul-Baha because of her spirituality, and he was content and happy with the process. The fact that he had no time to eat or enjoy his meals was not a problem. On one of these occasions, when the master was showing a little tiredness, he rose and happily remarked, "It is encouraging that after all this labor, at least she understands the concepts. This is refreshing. What would I have done if after all this effort, she still failed to comprehend the issues?" As the table talks continued, the Holy Family realized the significance of the precious gems coming to light and decided to have a writer attend the meetings and take down in Persian what was said. Miss Barney arranged for one of the son-in-laws of Abdul-Baha or one of the Persian of his secretariat of that period to make sure that the recording of the replies were made in an accurate way. Laura states that Abdul-Baha had also decided that they should be recorded in Persian. Laura had become quite fluent in Persian from her continual practice of it, as well as her study of the holy writings. And because of her familiarity with Baha'i terminology and Persian expressions, it was easier for her than some other Western believers who visited the master in those years. Dr. Afrokhte states that the discussions were concluded in an atmosphere of joy and amity. Then the time of compiling came. In the first months, when she started compiling her book, the situation in Akka had eased somehow. The task of correcting and rereading by Abdul-Baha and translation and comparison by Miss Barney was very difficult, especially when the compilation time arrived. She described how the master corrected the first Persian draft, and then the corrections were reviewed by Abdul-Baha. The master read the transcriptions and altered as needed with his red pen, then signed and stamped each one with his seal. Laura later wrote that it was the same stamp that Abdul-Baha used for his revealed tablets. The original Persian texts are in the Baha'i archives in Haifa. Laura Barney was able to complete the work and present this great service to the Baha'i world, a gift that will cause her to be remembered eternally. Some of the topics covered in the book were death, proverbs of God, soul, faith, will, man's destiny, immortality, life after death. She also had posed questions about Christianity, birth of Christ, his resurrection, and the Trinity. At first, she had not intended to publish them. It was simply for her future reference. However, she requested permission from Abdul-Baha in 1907 to publish it, which was granted. The book was first called The Table Talks. She published it in English, titled Some Answered Questions. In Persian, Nurul Baha fi Mufawazat, in 1908. She also collaborated with Hippolyte Dreyfus to translate it into English. The French is titled Les Leçons de Saint Jean d'Arc, which was published the same year. So this is how this work, unique in all religious literature, came into existence. This being Laura Barney's most outstanding achievement, which immortalized her name in the Baha'i world over. Abdul-Baha was also freed that year after the revolution in the Ottoman Empire and the overthrow of the Sultan. Now let us talk about her marriage. Laura and Hippolyte had collaborated on different projects, including the translation of Some Answered Questions, and had taken several trips at the request of the master before they realized how well they could work together. They also discovered their common aspirations. In a tablet to Laura, Abdul-Baha mentioned the importance of service in the cause of God, and then perhaps in response to a question from her regarding marriage, he stated, "This doth not preclude marriage. Thou canst take unto thyself a husband, and at the same time serve the cause of God. The one doth not preclude the other." Laura and Hippolyte married in April in 1911 and adopted the last name of Dreyfus Barney. Their lives, both before and after their marriage, were filled with partnership and untiring activities and travels. Her Baha'i activities intensified after this union. Laura and her husband, now Mr. and Mrs. Dreyfus Barney, had major roles during Abdul-Baha's first trip to the West in 1911. Laura wrote, "When the master visited Europe, I again gained admittance to his presence." Juliet Thompson, an American artist and a friend of Laura, has recorded her memoirs of those days with several references to Laura and Hippolyte. The Dreyfus Barneys were present with the master in Thonon-les-Bains, France. Juliet Thompson remembers that in Thonon, the master was either with Laura and Hippolyte in her room, or they were in his room, in the most charming informality. In September of that year, the Dreyfus Barneys traveled from Paris to London to assist the master with translations during his stay at the home of Lady Blomfield, an early Irish believer who had visited the master in the Holy Land. They were among the scores of friends who arrived during this stay. Lady Blomfield wrote that foremost among our visitors were Monsieur and Madame Dreyfus Barney, the brilliant French scholar, and his no less brilliant American wife, who spoke Persian with Abdul-Baha, translated for him, and were amongst helpful, courteous, and translated for him, and were altogether helpful, courteous, and charming. The master's visit to Paris began on October 3rd. The Dreyfus Barneys found an apartment for him in the French capital. His residence was a delightful and sunny apartment at number 4 Rue du Camion. The Dreyfus Barneys were again serving as interpreters for him and for several others. It was in 1912 that Abdul-Baha traveled to the United States. During his first visit to Washington, D.C., the Dreyfus Barneys were not present. The second visit of the master to Washington, D.C. was in May of that year. Laura, in a letter, wrote that she had the honor of attaining his presence during this visit, as did her husband. During this visit, Abdul-Baha spent a large portion of his time speaking to believers. One afternoon, he addressed a group of women and then visited the neighborhood house, a settlement to provide cultural awareness among blue-collar workers. It had been established through the efforts of Laura's mother. Laura was present at both events and had accompanied Master in the car afterwards. That evening, he had dinner at the home of Laura's mother. After leaving the United States in December 1912, the Master stopped in London. The Dreyfus Barneys were again present. Abdul-Baha visited Paris a second time in January of 1913. Laura and her husband, who had returned to Paris, attended many of significant gatherings. They were also among those who hosted meetings in Paris where seekers and inquirers were welcome. Laura and her husband, who had traveled to the United States, boarded a ship in California for Japan in 1914. They planned to visit Indochina and other regions of Eastern Asia in response to the wishes of the master. They stayed in Japan for a short time and met with the Baha'is there. When they arrived in China, they heard the news of the start of World War I, and they were forced to return to France. By the end of December, Hippolyte assumed his military obligations as a military guard, and Laura served with the American Ambulance Corps as a night nurse in Paris. The Ambulance Corps was the type of military institution that American calls a hospital. Laura also volunteered for the American Red Cross. She became its delegate for the Refugees and Repatriation Service. During the last years of the war, Laura worked with us in south of France and was mainly engaged with refugee and refugee relief activities. After the war, Laura was appointed Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor in 1925 for her work among the wounded. Soon after the war, the Dreyfus Barneys went on pilgrimage to visit Abdul-Baha in 1919. They were the first pilgrims to arrive from the West after the war. They returned to Akka again in 1921, on their way to the Far East. This time they traveled to Vietnam, Indochina, Southern China, Burma, and India. It was in Rangoon, Burma, that they heard of Abdul-Baha's passing. There is no doubt that this was shocking news to Laura and her husband, who had devoted their lives to his cause. They were thinking of cutting their trip short and travel to the Holy Land, but the Holy Family asked them not to do so. So they crossed India very fast. While in India, in the winter of 1922, they requested a visit with Mahatma Gandhi. The day that they were permitted to visit, was during Gandhi's Silence Day, and he wrote down his answers to their questions. Not long after the passing of Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi made a decision to call several capable and experienced Baha'is to Haifa to consult with them on the future of the Baha'i faith. Laura and Hippolyte were among those honored ones who went to share their grief in the company of their friends. Shoghi Effendi discussed with these believers the needs to develop the foundation for the election of the Universal House of Justice. In a letter to her sister, Laura wrote that Abdul Baha's family was filling the great vacancy left in their lives by continual activity in carrying out his wishes. After World War I, Laura became interested in the League of Nations, predecessor of the United Nations. The League was the first international intergovernmental organization whose principal mission was the maintenance of the world peace, and its social and humanitarian principles aligned with her own. Another organization that attracted Laura to his goals was the International Council of Women. Since its inception, the Council's aims have been consistent: the unification of women's organizations for action to promote human rights, sexual equality, peace, and women's involvement in international sphere. All these were dear to Laura's heart. She became the Council's representative to the League of Nations and played an important roles in different capacities. She once had said that her activities with the International Council of Women were motivated by its goals as earlier advanced by the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Hippolyte, Laura's life partner, whose distinctive and inestimable services, according to Shoghi Effendi, achieved for him a standing which few have as yet to be attained, died towards the end of 1928. This loss caused Laura overwhelming sadness and sorrow. She had lost the closest person in her life. They had a rich life together. She was not yet 50 years old when she became a widow. After his death, she tried to overcome her loneliness and her deep sorrow by intensifying her efforts on behalf of the faith and the cause of peace. In 1932, she was a brilliant speaker, emphasized the importance of international peace in her talks during extensive travels throughout the world, including across Canada and in 1935 in several countries in the Middle East. Laura was promoted to Officer of the French Legion of Honor, the highest French decoration created by Napoleon in 1937. As an American citizen, she was advised to leave Paris at the onset of World War II. She continued her activities on this side of the Atlantic. In 1941, she had an important responsibility, which was her service as a member of the United States delegation to the Second American Conference of the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation held in Havana, Cuba. And also at the request of the Guardian, she attended the celebration in Wilmette of the centenary of the birth of the Baha'i faith in 1944. As a brilliant speaker, she gave a moving address at this event. After her return to Paris at the end of World War in 1946, Laura realized that some of her belongings had been taken by the German secret police. The most valuable of all were her memoirs and her notes from early trips. She had many priceless notes which recounted her personal witnessing of Baha'i history. She had wished to compile and send them to Shoghi Effendi before publication and distribution, but that did not prove possible. Laura Barney remained active in her Baha'i life in Paris, guiding and meeting with prominent people of the Baha'i faith. She also continued her work under the auspices of United Nations. She was happy to see the teachings of her faith materializing through the work of United Nations and UNESCO, helping to bring world consciousness to the importance of education and brotherhood throughout all the continents. In 1960, Laura and her sister Natalie donated their mother's home in Washington, D.C. to Smithsonian Institution in memory of their mother, to be used as an intimate venue for arts and cultural programs. The Smithsonian Institution is a group of museums and education and research centers. The house was later purchased by the government of Republic of Latvia in 2001 after Smithsonian Institution found the expense of the upkeep of the building too high. Laura Barney stayed in Paris for the rest of her life. Friends visited her occasionally, and she lived with the memories of her rich and fruitful life. Although her body was handicapped by rheumatism and a childhood accident, her mind was as alert and brilliant as ever. Her beautiful earthly life came to an end on August 18, 1974, at the age of 94. According to her wishes, she was buried in the same plot as her sister Natalie in Paris. An appreciative message was sent by the Universal House of Justice, recognizing her outstanding achievement during the heroic age of the faith. The death of this open-minded woman from America who lived in France, traveled around the globe, and learned of the new religious teachings from Iran was reported in major newspapers on both sides of Atlantic, such as in the Washington Post, the Herald Tribune, the New York Times, Le Monde, and the Washington Star. This ends some highlights of the life of this amazing woman. Our time today gave us only a glimpse of the life and work of this zealous and devoted Baha'i, a true world citizen who lived a Baha'i life, both in her words and in her deeds. She tried to bring the world closer together, helped create mutual understanding between people, and devoted her life to humanitarian activities. Laura Dreyfus Barney moved easily between two worlds, that of her wealthy and flamboyant family and that of her Baha'i family, and her spiritual and intellectual partnership with her distinguished husband. The worlds of the rich and the world of the poor, the sojourns at the summer resorts of Europe and America, and her visits in the old prison city of Akka. When some people would have left one world for the other, she moved gracefully between the two worlds. Laura Barney met a spiritual leader from the East. Abdul Baha accepted his teachings and the Baha'i faith and gave those beliefs a central role in her life. This remarkable woman had heard Abdul Baha state that we were not to keep for ourselves alone what he has entrusted to us for humanity. It is in following this advice that she devoted her life to implementing into action the principles that she had believed in with an outward-looking approach. Laura Barney challenged many of her immediate social circles and selected a path different from what her social milieu would have dictated. Someone who knew Laura Barney well wrote, "With her keen intelligence, logical mind, and investigative nature, she devoted her whole life from adolescence to improving human relations, bringing together people of different races, classes, and nations." He continued, "Those who had the rare privilege of knowing her over a period of many decades can testify that her undaunted zeal for the objective of the brotherhood of man remained alive and glowing to the very last day of her life on earth. Her services were rendered joyfully with steadfastness and perseverance. Besides compiling some answered questions, she had many other contributions to her faith. But however, Laura Clifford Dreyfus Barney's primary service, known throughout the Baha'i world, is for compilation of some answered questions, a memento for future generations, as a significant book from the utterances of Abdul Baha. This book was in estimable value and service to her faith. It has been translated into 40 languages, reprinted several times, and the most recent edition, which was retranslated, was published in 2014. It was her greatest accomplishment and achieved immortal fame for her. Shoghi Effendi refers to Laura Barney's work as imperishable service to be transmitted to posterity. Laura Barney, this handmaid of Baha, this handmaiden of Baha, deserves honor in the annals of the history. I am glad that her full biography is now available. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share with you some parts of my research and some aspects of her life. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I hadn't heard like so much of that before. So we really appreciate all of your expertise. So if anyone has questions now, you can please go ahead and put it in the chat and we will have time to get those answered. So while people are thinking of questions, have you ever tried to find Laura Clifford Barney's stolen belongings and her notes?
Thank you for the question. Yes, while I was doing my research, actually, I started my research in 2000, and then since then, I have tried many places to find her personal belongings. You know, she had the last name of Dreyfus Barney. Dreyfus is related to a Jewish family, and also she is 1/4 Jewish. So, and she lived in a very wealthy area of Paris. That's why her belongings were stolen by the Nazis. So I have researched at several Holocaust Museum archives because some of those stolen material have been retrieved. I have researched at the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles, at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC, at the archives in Germany. Some researchers have helped me there. And unfortunately, not much have been found until very recent years that some of those material have appeared online. And I refer to the items that I've been able to find. They are 2 books and some jewelry from her, but most probably the notes and her documents were not saved. Probably they saved only valuable material, and some handwritten notes were not of much importance or value to whoever saved the stolen materials. So few items have been found, but not her notes.
Did she have any children?
She did not, no.
Okay. Why did you research Laura Barney? Like, what led you to that?
Actually, that's the first question people ask me. I started my research in 2000. That's when her family home that they had donated to Smithsonian was being sold and its contents were being auctioned off. I was curious to see if there were any material related to the fate among the documents being moved from the house. So I went to the house, visited it, and then I realized that all the letters and correspondence of herself and her mother that were in the house had moved to Smithsonian Institution's archives. So that's when I started my research. I went to the archives. They, at the time, which I think is still the same, they had 32 boxes of photographs and letters, which I researched. And a few years later, I was asked to present a paper at the Baha'i conference on the 100th anniversary of the publication of some answered questions. That was in 2008. So I continued my research and I became more interested to learn about her life. When she compiled some answered questions, she was 1908, she was 29 years old. And she had a long life. She lived until the age of 94. So I was very curious as to what she did the rest of her life. So that's how the research had continued for over 21 years.
Wow. And what did the newspapers in Iran write about the Westerners' trip to Iran?
You know, I have researched about that at several places. It's very interesting that they were two foreigners traveling in Iran. Obviously, they look different than others. They visited several cities and they were invited to many Baha'i gatherings. They were met by many dignitaries. I haven't been able to find anything. There must be some mention of these people. For example, if she had met with the Crown Prince in Tabriz, there should be some mention. But I had somebody in Iran who helped me with researching about their visit to Iran, and they haven't been able to, she hasn't been able to find anything. Hopefully somebody can research more, maybe at the Library of Congress. They have microfilm of all those newspapers of that time. The dates are known, so maybe somebody can continue researching about it. That would be very interesting to find out.
Thank you. How has learning about her influenced your life?
I try to follow in her footsteps.
Someone asked, where can I find more information on the life of Laura Barney? So do you want to speak about the biography you've written?
Yes, as I said, I have been researching about her life for the past 21 years. The full biography, it's both her Baha'i activities and her humanitarian activities with the International Council of Women, with League of Nations, with United Nations, with UNESCO, and many other accomplishments that I wasn't able to talk about during this talk. They are all in the book. And it was published this June 2022, and it's published by George Ronald. It's available on their website, grbooks.com. It's available on Amazon. It's in United States. It's available on the Bahai Bookstore, and I believe some other. The Amazon may be the easiest because they have print on demand. Wherever you live in the world, they can print it and deliver it in a few days to you.
Did her sister and mother ever become Baha'is?
That's a very good question. Her sister met Abdul Baha in London. Abdul Baha visited her sister, Natalie Barney, in Paris. But she was an atheist. She didn't believe in God and she didn't believe in religion. So meeting Abdul Baha, I don't think influenced her. She was very strong in her beliefs. And it's interesting how these two sisters had chosen different paths in life. Her mother became a Baha'i. She visited Abdul Baha while her daughter was in Haifa and Akka in 1905. She stayed for about a month. And when she returned to Washington, her life changed. She did a lot for women's rights and for the poor. And something that was common with those early Baha'is, they accepted the faith and they stayed in their original faith. There were some other believers who were like that. So she remained a Baha'i in her heart, yes.
How do you feel about some answered questions impact?
I think Shoghi Effendi had talked eloquently about it. It was her imperishable service. At the time, there were not that many books addressing some of the questions that she had posed. Her questions about Christianity and Bible and Trinity, and she posed those questions and she received Abdul Baha's answers. So I think it was very important at the time and it still is today.
Are there any tablets revealed on behalf of Laura Clifford Barney?
Yes, there are about 28 tablets. Some of them have been translated, officially translated, and they are in her biography. Yes, I have about 28 copies of 28 tablets to her.
Is some answered questions available in Persian?
Yes, it's Mofawezat. It's called Mofawezat. It was published the same year as Some Answered Question. So the three languages in Persian, English, and French, they were all published in 1908.
Looks like those are all the questions we have. So thank you so much again to Ms. Khademi for this really informative talk. And we'll put the link to her biography in the description box of this video when we upload it to YouTube. So if anyone wants to purchase that and learn more, you can go ahead and do so. So next week, our speaker will be Dr. Michael Penn, and his topic will be reflections on the happiness and development of the human spirit. So if you'd like to be on our mailing list and you're not already, I've put the link to our contact form. And we'll end today with a prayer by Abdul Baha set to music.
Oh God, refresh and gladden my spirit, purify my heart, illumine my powers. I lay all my affairs in thy hand, thou art my guide and my refuge. I will no longer be sorrowful and grieved. I will be a happy and joyful being. Oh God, I will no longer be full of anxiety, nor will I let trouble harass me. I will not dwell on the to myself. I dedicate myself to thee, myself to thee, O Lord. O God, thou art more friend to me than I am to myself. I dedicate myself to thee, myself to thee, O Lord. O God, refresh and gladden my spirit, purify my heart, illumine my power, O Lord.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye.